I want to tell you a bit about the estate of Jean Arp today, because Jean Arp is quite an exciting example how things not only always go well with an estate, and how that mustn't be the end of the world, and how you can, if you go back to square one, if you go back to asking these questions Christy so well explained to us, you can reposition an estate and the legacy you're entrusted with. It would be wonderful to have the time to tell you much more about Hans Arp, the artist. But today I want to focus on the story of the estate of Hans Arp. But just to remember all of us, who was Hans Arp? Hans Arp was certainly one of the masters of sculpture in the 20th century. He was an extremely communicative, innovative person, which led to the very interesting situation that he was a member of many, many artist groups, even of artist groups which at that time were kind of contradictory to each other. He was a member of Dada, a founding member of Dada. He worked with the Surrealists. He was a member with Cercle et Carré and with Abstraction et Création, two groups which were actually opposing to each other, but he was capable of being part of both. He was married in his first marriage to another very talented artist, Sophie Teuber-Arp. Sophie Teuber and him, there's a long story of their collaboration, which is a wonderful story to have a full evening of its own. And Sophie Teuber-Arp passed away tragically of an accident in the house of Max Bill, the Swiss sculptor, in 1942, and left Arp quite devastated. They didn't have any children together. And Sophie was for him a real counterpart. I wouldn't use the word muse, it would totally underestimate her position towards. They were really equals and in a very positive dialogue. He later then married Margriet Hagenbach-Arp. Margriet was a friend of both Sophie Teuber and Jean Arp. She was a great collector of her own. She was quite wealthy. She had been buying work by Max Ernst, by Hans Arp, by Sophie Teuber-Arp, and many other artists of that generation very, very early on. And there's this wonderful story that when Hans Arp came over his grief, after I would say 5-6 years of moaning in which he could almost not work, he felt that he shouldn't be alone anymore. And he wrote Margriet Hagenbach a letter saying, "My friend, I don't want to be alone anymore. Do you want to come and live with me?" She later said and recalled she had the feeling that Arp would expect her to jump on the train immediately and come to his house within 24 hours. It took a longer while. But I'm telling you that a bit because Margriet later is very important for the estate and her position in the estate. She did come to his house. It took maybe 2 months for her to show up. She didn't leave again. And she was a very, very good manager to her husband. She knew the art world. She knew how to maneuver the art world out of her position of being a strong and potent collector herself. And she managed his career through the 50s and 60s until he passed away in 66. These 50s and 60s were really a phase of great success for Arp. He really went to the zenith of the art world. He was awarded the grand prize at the Biennale of Venice at the same year Max Ernst was awarded it. He had solo exhibitions at the MoMA. He had solo exhibitions at the Tate. He had solo exhibitions later at the Metropolitan. He was represented by strong, powerful galleries at that time in New York by Sidney Janis. And he sold well. And when he passed away in 1966, one would think that's a no-brainer to take care of that estate. What happened then? Here you see a picture of his grave. He himself designed his gravestone by putting his iconic work, the star, on his grave. As I said, he died in 66. He left Margriet Hagenbach-Arp. Also with Margriet, he had no children. And Margriet, although she was already elderly at that stage, she was in her 60s. She was still of good health, and she did further a very good job in managing the estate of her husband until around mid-70s. In the mid-70s, She had had some tax problems because of inheritance tax in France. It wasn't easy to deal with the dual citizenship, German and French. Jean Ark was of both nationalities. And in the mid-70s, she got more and more advice to think about setting up some form of non-profit situation to solve the tax situation. At that stage, she met a German art dealer. His name is Johannes Wasmuth, was Johannes Wasmuth. And Johannes Wasmuth had created near Bonn at Rolandseck a cultural center called the Bahnhof Rolandseck, and which had been at that time quite attractive. All the politicians came there, even Kennedy came and visited there to look at art. So it was really at the core of the Bonner Republic of the 70s. And Johannes Wasmuth and Margriet came along quite well, and he convinced her to give the estate to a newly founded organization called the Stiftung Hans Ark und Sophie Teuber-Arp e.V., and to make him the chair of that estate. For Margriet, this had the advantage of solving tax problems, and at the same time, she felt that she was aging. She didn't have any children to follow her in this position, and she was happy to have somebody help her to support in this work. Johannes Wasmuth did this job until the mid-90s, and it's a bit difficult how to phrase this, but he sometimes mixed up his position as an art dealer with that as the head of the estate. He did it on a public relationship side very well. He sometimes didn't go quite by the rule book concerning certain other aspects of managing this estate. And in the mid-90s, when he passed away, he didn't only leave a big pile of debt to the estate, because he was somebody who was crazy for art and he couldn't stop buying art, and he did that on the expenses of others and forced the estate to sell a lot of art in order to pay that debt. But also he dealt with the question of posthumous casting in a bit freer way than he should have. And so in the mid-90s, early 2000, and I think the audience from Germany knows more about that than the international audience, the Arp estate was in the discussion in the German newspapers a lot about posthumous casting. And it was really a pity, because the whole discussion didn't focus anymore on the work of Arp and really getting interest in his work going, but it was all about politics, rumors, and aspects like that. And so this was the situation when in 2009 the head of the foundation board passed away, and a new head came to the foundation who had no connection with the past. And he said, well, we have to kind of get back to square one and think how we can deal with this. I mean, we had at that time already had almost a 30-year history of the estate. And on the one hand, it was really a bucket of gold, because you have this wonderful artist, you have this wonderful art, you have an artist in an international context, and at the same time you were kind of stuck. And that was the moment we got involved, because we had been dealing with the estate of the grandfather of my husband. We had known the art market as collectors and being business-wise involved in the art market quite well. And he asked us to develop a strategy to how can one get out of this Sackgasse, Sack de Kühl, this dead end. And so we developed a strategy. Half a year later, he came back to us and asked us if we would be willing to help transform the strategy into reality. And out of this developed a very interesting collaboration, just to make it transparent how we are set up today at the foundation. We are kind of three parties supporting the oeuvre of Hans Ark. One is the board of the foundation. They are non-paid. They are doing this on a non-profit basis. They are very well in the whole strategic and financial area. They're not that deeply into the art market. Then there's a curator here, Mr. Steinkamp, who's here also today. And she does the everyday curatorial work, and then it's us as an external party serving as a kind of external CEO kind of structure to the estate and advising the Board of Trustees, which at the end then take the decision. And so what situation did we face on a more general term 2009? It was that, as I said, the interest had gone more to politics of the estate than to the work of Hans Ark. And I have to say, Hans Ark kind of fell out of fashion also. We had almost no academic interest in his work anymore. I think the last doctor thesis was written beginning of the 80s. And I find always academic interest very exciting and important, because I find it really important that each generation of young academics finds their own approach to an artist's estate. That's, for me, one of the key elements of keeping a legacy alive. We had very outdated catalogue raisonnés. The last one was done in 1968. We hadn't had major museums exhibitions for almost 20 years. The last one in America was 1983. We had questions about posthumous casting. Let me just include 3 sentences about the situation with posthumous casting with Hans Ark, because we heard this morning the statement of Mary Moore concerning posthumous casting with Henry Moore. Hans Ark had a very different approach to posthumous casting than Henry Moore did. Henry Moore in his will left clear saying that he didn't want any posthumous casting to be done. Hans Ark explicitly wanted posthumous casting to be done, but only within the editions he had envisioned. He had generally had editions of 3 plus AP or 5 plus AP. And there were quite a number of works where the editions hadn't been finished at the time of his death in 1966. And he had put up a whole list of casts which he would be okay with if they would be done posthumously. And in 1977, his widow and his secretary, Greta Stör, gave this list over to the foundation. And that is, until today, the basis for us to do posthumous casting. But this whole process wasn't transparent in 2009. Nobody knew what was going on. Was there posthumous casting which was authorized, or wasn't it authorized? And so that was a big black hole, and we'll talk about later how we tried to bring light into this hole. And all this led to the fact that his work was also undervalued in the art market. If you compare it to his peers, if you compare it to people like Henry Moore, like Calder, other sculptors of his generation, it was dramatically undervalued and undertraded. So we sat together with the Board of Trustees for a year, and really kind of like what Helen described at the beginning when she took over the Vandenberg estate with her brothers, we shut the doors. And we took our time to dig into key questions and try to find for us a new reason for being, although we had been already 30 years old. It was the question of what do we want to achieve for Ark? And how can we recreate interest in his work? And also important, how can we regain trust in the estate? And is there a purpose for the estate in the future, and what could that purpose be? There were many options we discussed. We discussed about opening a second museum with all the holdings of the estate, because the estate owns the largest collections of Arks worldwide, so there would have absolutely been a basis to do a museum. But we came to the conclusion that it would make much more sense to send these works out in the world than trying to get the world to us into a single museum. There were options of closing the estate, saying we'll sell everything, we'll close it. Maybe after 30 years, the reason for being is over. And then there was the option to try to shape the future for Ark again. And we defined 3 goals for the estate. One was to try to reposition Ark as one of the most important sculptures of the 20th century. The second one is to establish the foundation as the study center for Hans Ark. And we wanted to take over a more active role in the academic museums world as well as the art market. And how did we do that? Or how are we still doing it? It's actually now 7 years, and we're still in the middle of the process. The basis for our actions was that we strongly believe that in the today's art world, the three pillars of the academic world, the museum world, and the market are all equally important to keeping a legacy alive. You have to engage with the museum's world to have an artist shown. And if you like it or not, what is shown is sold, and what is sold is shown. So you have to work with the art market actively together. And again, what is reflected by the academic world has influence on the curators because they're very strongly interlinked, and by that again on the museum's world. So these three columns were the basis of our actions. And the very first action was setting up or getting a new catalogue raisonné going. I know that many estates take over these responsibilities by themselves, which in many cases is the best choice to do. For us, with this history of the estate and the lost trust in the estate's work, we said it's more important that we do one thing, that we open up our archives to independent research. Ari Hartog, who we'll get to know later, he took over that research. He had access to any little piece of paper in the estate. And what he developed was really a quite remarkable method of giving transparency to the question of posthumous and lifetime casting in the catalogue raisonné. And I show here, you see those little signs in front of the single works. The catalogue raisonné lists all known casts of Ark today, which are about 3,000. And what was for us important was that anybody who gets a piece of art on the table, if it's an auction house, if it's a scholar, if it's a museum curator, and wants to know, is this work an authenticated work, he can get the Hartog out of his shelf, he can open it up, and within a second he knows if it was authenticated or not. And this little sign down there with this one here, those are now the non-authenticated works. And by that, the estate also did a whole cleaning up of its own history, because it showed where did we exceed the authentication lists. And the works which the estate had sold before, those works the owners we wrote to and offered them to exchange them for authenticated work or to reimburse them for them buying work which was not okay. But just to give you a relation also, we have today about 3,000 known casts of work by Hans Ark, and 36 were not okay. And if you compare this small number, and each of these were one too much, but still it's a relatively small number compared to the overall size of the oeuvre, and compare that to the size of rumors there were before, it was really the best step we could take to create total transparency. And this notion of transparency is really for us the most important notions ever since, and is like a red line through all our activities. It's also the red line for the showroom which we created here in Berlin. The holdings of the estate were also not very transparent to the outside world. As I said, the estate owns the largest collection of ARPs worldwide, but they were all packed up in boxes, scattered in 3 different storages in Germany. And we had always lent to museums, but it was kind of coming back that the same 15, 20 blockbuster works were always requested for loan again and again and again because nobody knew what else was there. And so it's here in Berlin, it's open to the public for anybody who wants to visit, you're mostly welcome. It was important for us to try to display them in the way that they're totally transparent again, and we invited curators, we invite academics until today, if they plan a show, to come over and to really walk through the oeuvre of Hans Ark and to discover parts of his works which they even often don't know about. To look at the late work, to look at the early work, to understand by seeing the works and not only seeing images, how the work of Ark evolved. I was mentioning that for us, it was one of the goals to become the study center for Hans Ark worldwide. And that meant that we don't only want to open up the archives, but that we really want to support scholars in working with Ark, and to motivate young scholars to rethink, to work on subjects related to Hans Ark. And so in connection with the showroom, this is the same space here where the showroom of the collection is. We opened up a study center, and we financially support artists and art historians who work on Hans Ark and related matters. Then one of the next steps was that in 2015 we started biennial conferences where we tried to bring together the community of scholars working on Hans Ark, as well as galleries and art dealers who are involved in his work. And the next conference, this one was reflecting on the relationship Hans Ark had with the American market. And the next conference will be 2017 with the Kröller-Möller Museum. Then we're doing publications coming out of these conferences, bringing together the status quo of the academic research. And I'm very happy to say that also on the museum side, more activity has been picked up. In the last 3 years, we've seen a number of wonderful exhibitions, and we're having 3 important exhibitions coming up. One finally also in the United States. There will be a big retrospective at the National Sculptor Center in Dallas. And also here, I was stating at the beginning that our aim is to take over a more active role in the museum world, is that in the past it was more passive, that museums came to us, asked us for loans, and then we reacted, generally giving the loans. Today it's that Mrs. Steinkamp, our curator, and us, we try to develop exhibition ideas ourselves and to present these ideas to curators. Hopefully sometimes they pick them up, sometimes they develop them further, but it's always an idea of throwing a stone into the water and to more actively engage with the museum world. And I always try to encourage estates to go out and throw as many stones into the water and not only sit there and be in a more passive role. This also includes the art market. The estate today works with 3 wonderful galleries together. The first gallery is Mitchell & Nash, and they have been working with the estate for over 20 years now, always supporting the work of Ark, doing very important exhibitions in New York. Then it's the Gallery Thomas in Germany. German collectors are an important market to Ark, and that's why we chose to include a German gallery into the portfolio. And then we work with Hauser and Wirth together. And we are often asked, how does that work? Does that work well to have 3 galleries instead of 1? Are they in competition? Does it maybe give some fraction to the process? And what I discovered is that it works very well if the estate itself controls this process and is interested in creating these 3 galleries as a team. We really try to get them to be in dialogue with each other, to collaborate, to look what exhibitions can they do maybe together or in a way that they don't cannibalize each other, and also that they work together in secondary market activities. And I have to say that with these 3 galleries at least, it's a wonderful collaboration which they really as a team support the work of the estate and are great ambassadors for the work of Hans Ark in the art market. And all that has really led to effects, of which I hope many more will follow, that in the last 2 years we have given out already 10 scholarships, and a community of interested scholars is developing more and more. At the last conference we had more than 120 scholars working on Hans Ark already together here in Berlin. Also, the prices are rising. This is important for us, for our holdings, because we, as most foundations, finance ourselves by selling works by Hans Ark. And if the prices for Ark rise, the value of our assets rise, and we have more financial means to support our nonprofit causes. And this is a development which is happily going on at the moment. And so, what makes me the most happy in this whole process is that now after 7 years of work, the public is not longer talking about politics and the estate, but is talking about the work of Hans Ark, and I think that's the place he deserves. Thank you. Any questions? Yeah, Pierre.
My name is Pierre Valentin. When you took over the Ark estate, was there any money in the pot to make all this happen? And if not, how can one go about raising funds to generate this result?
That's a very interesting question. I think the Ark estate is typical in the sense that we have always been and still are art rich and cash poor. Ark didn't leave any endowment, and there has never been created a big endowment in the foundation, which also has to do with German foundation laws. We as a non-profit in Germany have to spend the money we make. Meaning that, and it sounds a bit awkward, but it's the way we're not allowed in our legal structure to build up an endowment which we then invest and then get money back. So the way we finance ourselves, and I think this counts for 90% of all estates, is by from time to time selling works. And just to give you an idea of specific figures, our annual budget is somewhere between 250 and 300,000 euros per year. This is a lot of money, but it's not a lot of money if you think also about what we try to create with that money. And if you look, for example, into our scholarship program, we have an annual budget of scholarships, which isn't a lot. We have 25,000 euros a year to give away on scholarships. And that might sound little, but for a student who gets 6,000 euros for 6 months writing about Jean Ark, it's a lot. And I think, especially in the academic field, you can reach a lot with limited means of money. And the second source of income is copyright. We have somewhere between 40 and 60,000 euros per year copyright, which is for German artists a lot. If you look at the numbers of the VG Bild, I think we only have 12 artists in Germany who have incomes of above 100,000 euros a year. But that only makes a small amount of our budget. The rest is through sales. Yes, Anthony.
What did you do about the patination of the posthumous casts? How did you deal with that?
With what?
With the patination, because Ark
yeah.
worked on the patina of the sculpture.
Absolutely. Well, the interesting thing is, and I think that's why with Ark, posthumous casting is totally okay, is Ark himself never worked on the patina. For him, he was the one developing the form. He always worked in plaster. And the moment the plaster form was finished, he gave it to craftsmen outside. At the end of his life, he worked a lot with NOAC, and NOAC are the foundry which are taking care of that still until to today. And it was mostly, interesting enough, Magritte in the last 20 years, which were his most successful years, who then said, well, it's okay if you do this one in a dark brown patina, and that one for the American market in a shiny gold patina. It wasn't Ark that much who cared about it. And I think that's a great difference, for example, towards Brancusi. I mean, we all know Brancusi was really the one standing there, making the patina, working on the patina. And the moment an artist who is so involved with the patina, if you then do posthumous casting, you leave out a very important aspect of his artistic methods. And this whole posthumous casting question, I think the legal aspect is only one aspect. We all, those who are copyright holders, they are legally allowed to do that. But I think the most important thing is respecting the artist's will, and at the same time reflecting on the artist's practice, how he did it, and to then see if posthumous casting fits in that or not. We have another question over here.
Hi. How do you work with the other foundations? I believe there's a museum in Paris or outside Paris, or a foundation, Jean Arp, and I think one in Switzerland.
Yes, we have 3 ARP foundations which hold the name ARP Foundation. There's the Locarno one in Switzerland, there is the Clamart one in France, and then there's us. Just 2 sentences. It's a bit complicated, but you can summarize it quite well shortly. The Swiss foundation derived not out of the estate of Hans Ark, but out of the personal collection of Margriet Hagenbach-Arp. Hans Arp and Margriet lived in Locarno at the end of their lives, and this house, in combination with the personal collection of Margriet Hagenbach-Arp, was the basis for the Fondazione Arp in Locarno. And she was a big collector of Arp, so they obviously have a lot of work by Arp, but they also have other works, and they're not involved with the whole copyrights and everything like that. Then you have the Fondation Arp in Clamart, which is today independent, but was until the mid-90s a subsidiary of the German foundation. And they had to become independent for tax reasons also. And if you look at it, what are the holdings of these 3 estates? The Fondazione Arp in Locarno has the house and the personal collection of Margriet. The French collection has the old house of Sophie Teuber Arp and Hans Arp in Meudon. And they have the works which were made there in the house for that house. And the whole estate as itself, including the copyrights, the archives, the letters and everything, that went to the German foundation. And the history developed in such a way that today we have very good relationships with the Swiss foundation. We have good relationships with the French on an everyday level, like we exchange archival information, we exchange aspects of authentication. I have to say, in some political aspects, they are not as transparent as the Swiss and we have become. And so there's sometimes some friction, but in general, it's okay.
Sorry, I think they have plasters. They have original.
They plasters,
no?
yeah.
Okay.
Yes. We have a question there.
I was very much taken by your study center and the kind of control exercised in a, dare I say it, kind of holistic manner in relation to Arp's work. And I was wondering, what is your view, perhaps your private view, not that of the foundation, but your private view on the notion of estates being taken over, which is often the case, or settled at commercial galleries? Do you find that there's a conflict of interest there?
It's a wide topic. It's the question of galleries and estates. I think it's first of all always important, we always read about the estate so-and-so is now represented by or taken over by. And it's a wording which includes many different options. There are estates which are really taken over literally, being bought by galleries. There are, on the other hand, estates which simply do their selling through galleries. And then there's a whole variety in the middle, where galleries support estates in administrative issues, where they support estates in organizing or funding catalogue raisonnés. So I think it's always very important to look for each estate, what is the specific solution? And that's why I often find it so important that on the side of the estate, there's enough art market know-how to navigate these options to the best benefit of the estate. Yes?
One quick question. You mentioned about financing before, and the fact that you were kind of created a pool of money that will finance the operations of the foundation. Mm-hmm. Long term, what's the plan? I mean, once those funds run out, how do you expect to maintain the operation?
As I said, as a German non-profit entity, we're not allowed to create an endowment, but we have to spend the money we have. And that means we have to be very careful and strategic in choosing the pieces we sell. And we have devoted ourselves to selling as little as possible and to as much as necessary. And it's always, again and again, each year a process of defining what work can we miss and what work will bring enough money to do the next funding round. So it's a bit a year-to-year approach. I would much rather prefer to really create an endowment, develop investment strategies, and by that put the foundation more on an independent level, but we are legally not allowed to do that. I think we have time for one last question. Yes? Here, Karl.
It seems that all of the foundations in any of the countries are fending for themselves in their own way. Mm-hmm. However, the legislation of the country is set up. Is there any kind of dialogue between a foundation and the government or the country? Is there an interest of Germany in Arp's work? Is there any, or for that matter, French foundation would have an interest in the Picasso? I guess they have a big museum there. So could you say something about that?
I think that's a very, very interesting aspect. It's the question of the relation of estates preserving cultural heritage and the appreciation of doing so through the public. I think it's a difficult field, and it's much too less is done. I know that in Belgium, and maybe Helen can talk about that a bit more tomorrow, there is an interest, for example, in the government, or she has also been creating and really working on creating an interest of the government in the cultural heritage position and importance of estates. Certainly the governments are always interested in famous dead artists, yes, but they seldom support the estates, or never ever. I don't know a single European country, at least, where there's any public funding for that. And it sometimes surprises because there's a lot of public funding for living artists in various ways, but the moment they're dead, there's no option anymore. And that's why it means that they all have to fund themselves privately. And so, no, there isn't anything. Let's work on it together. Yes. Well, thank you. I think